Here, at the heart of Credenhill, just beyond the relentless rhythm of the training grounds, lies a place that operates on a different kind of time. It isn't measured in drill schedules or forced marches. It's measured in seasons. This is the Regimental Memorial Garden, a small, immaculately kept square of green and stone that serves as the soul of 22 SAS. It's a place of profound silence, broken only by the buzz of a lazy bee or the respectful whisper of the wind through the leaves of a silver birch. The air here smells of damp, rich earth, of rain-washed stone, and of the faint, sweet perfume of the roses that line the central path. Each bush is dedicated to a fallen operator, its roots sunk deep into the same Herefordshire soil they once called home. Arthur Croft moved through this stillness like a ghost. At 75, his back was a gentle curve, a long bow bent by time, but not yet broken. His face was a road map of a life lived outdoors, etched with the fine lines of 1,000 smiles and a few deeper sorrows. He wore a faded olive-green jacket, its cuffs frayed, and a pair of mud-stained work trousers. To any casual observer, he was just an old groundskeeper, a harmless pensioner pottering about. But it was his hands that told the real story. Gnarled and scarred, with knuckles like polished walnuts, they moved with a slow, deliberate grace. Just now, they were tending to a bush of remembrance roses, their deep crimson petals a stark and beautiful contrast to the gray stone memorial behind them. With a pair of perfectly oiled secateurs, Arthur found a single yellowed leaf near the base of the stem. There was a soft, decisive snip. He caught the leaf before it could fall, his movements economical, fluid, born of a lifetime of practice. He wasn't just gardening, he was paying his respects. His gaze drifted for a moment to the wall behind the roses, a long, polished slab of black granite engraved with name after name, each one a story cut short. He didn't need to read them. He knew them by heart, especially the one right in the middle. Sergeant Mac Mackenzie, a lifetime ago, and yesterday. This sacred quiet was not meant to last. It was torn apart not by a sudden noise but by a gradual, brutal intrusion. The sound began as a distant thumping, the rhythmic pounding of boots on the hard-packed earth of the perimeter track. It grew louder, accompanied by the strained, guttural grunts of men pushing their bodies to the absolute limit. Then they appeared. A group of 6 SAS candidates emerging from the dense woods that bordered the garden. They were caked in mud, their faces grim masks of exhaustion and aggression, their state-of-the-art gear clinging to their powerful frames. They moved like a pack of wolves, radiating a volatile energy that seemed to curdle the peaceful air. Leading them was Corporal Declan Roche. Dex, they called him. A mountain of a man, with a bull neck and a jaw that looked like it had been specifically designed for chewing up lesser men and spitting them out. He carried his exhaustion not as a burden, but as a trophy, a testament to his own endurance. He and his team stumbled to a halt on the gravel path just outside the low box hedge that marked the garden's boundary, their harsh, ragged breathing sounding like an insult in the tranquil space. Roche spat a glob of phlegm onto the pristine gravel. "Right then, lads," he grunted, his voice a low rasp. 5 minutes. Rehydrate. Then it's the killing house. Last one there's buying the beers tonight. His cronies gave weak, tired grins, fumbling with their water packs. Their eyes, however, were already tracing a line across the memorial garden. The quickest route to the mess hall and their next phase of training wasn't along the winding gravel path. It was a straight line, directly across the perfectly manicured, almost holy turf of the central lawn. It was a shortcut of perhaps 30 feet, but in this place,
It was a mile of disrespect.
Arthur, who had been inspecting another rose bush with his back to them, felt the change in the atmosphere. It was a familiar feeling, the prickle of impending trouble, an instinct honed in places far less forgiving than this. He straightened up slowly, his joints protesting with a quiet groan, and turned to face them. He didn't say a word, he just stood there, his old secateurs held loosely in one hand, his presence a silent, unassuming barrier. He was just an old man, a gardener, standing between a pack of exhausted, aggressive soldiers and a patch of grass. And in that moment, the storm had arrived. If this story of quiet courage resonates with you, make sure to like this video and share it with someone who understands that heroes don't always wear a uniform. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tales that honor the silent warriors among us. For a long moment, nobody moved. The 6 candidates, breathing heavily in the sudden, sharp silence, looked from the old man to their leader. They were a single organism, and Corporal Roche was the head. Arthur, in turn, held Roche's gaze. He saw past the bulging muscles and the aggressive posture. He had seen eyes like that before, in the faces of young men in far-flung, desperate places. Eyes burning with a furious need to prove something, not to the world, but to the nagging doubt that lived deep inside them. The boy was a loaded weapon with the safety off, and Arthur knew that the first rule of dealing with such weapons was to show no fear. He simply stood, his weight resting evenly on his worn boots, the secateurs a small, dark weight in his hand. He was a part of the garden, as rooted and patient as the ancient oak that stood sentinel at the far corner. Roche was the first to break the tableau. A slow, insolent smirk spread across his lips, twisting his handsome features into a mask of contempt. He looked Arthur up and down, a deliberate, dismissive appraisal that started at the scuffed toe of his boots and ended on his weathered face. He saw nothing of value, just an obstacle, an irrelevance. He let out a short, sharp huff of a laugh, a sound devoid of any humor. "Look at this, lads," he said, not to Arthur but to the audience behind him. "Think we found a garden gnome?" A few of the men chuckled, the sound thin and nervous. They were exhausted, and a bit of cruel sport was a welcome distraction. Roche took a heavy, deliberate step forward, the gravel crunching loudly under his boot. He stopped just inches from the meticulously edged lawn, his shadow falling across the perfect green grass like a stain. He pointed a thumb back at the winding path. "That way's for visitors, old-timer. We've got work to do." He wasn't asking, he was informing. Arthur did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet authority in his tone was more arresting than any shout could ever be. "The path is for everyone, Corporal," he said, his voice a low, gravelly burr. "This," he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod towards the lawn and the stone monument behind it, "is for them." He didn't need to explain who they were. In this place, the air was thick with their memory. The words hung there, simple, factual, and unyielding. It was an instruction, not a debate. For a second, Roche's smirk faltered. The old man's utter lack of deference was unsettling. He had expected him to scurry away, intimidated. This calm refusal to be cowed was a challenge, and in Roche's world, every challenge had to be met with overwhelming force. "Is that an order, Grandad?" Roche sneered, leaning in slightly, invading Arthur's personal space. The smell of stale sweat and exertion washed over the old man. Arthur didn't flinch. "It's a matter of respect," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "Something they don't teach you on the assault course." The directness of the retort struck a nerve. Roche's eyes narrowed. "Respect?" he scoffed, his voice rising. "Listen, you old relic. Me and my lads have been crawling through mud and razor wire for 10 hours straight while you've been trimming bloody roses. We are the reason places like this are safe. We've earned the right to walk wherever we damn well please. That's respect. Earned in sweat, not soil." He puffed out his chest, the very picture of arrogant indignation. At the back of the group, Trooper Jensen shifted his weight, his boots grinding nervously on the gravel. He was the youngest of the candidates, barely 20, and a sense of deep unease was coiling in his gut. His grandfather had served in the paras, and Jensen had been raised on stories of tradition and solemn duty. His eyes weren't on Roche or the old man. They were fixed on the black granite wall, on the endless columns of names glinting in the afternoon sun. He could feel the weight of those names, the silent, collective gaze of the regiment's fallen. To him, stepping on that lawn would be like walking over his own family's grave. He wanted to say something, to voice the protest screaming in his mind, but the words died in his throat. In the brutal hierarchy of selection, a candidate did not question a senior man. To do so was to invite a world of pain and mark yourself as a man who wouldn't be a team player. So, he stayed silent, his fists clenched at his sides, shame and duty warring within him. Arthur saw the flicker of conflict in the young soldier's eyes, and it was the only thing that gave him a sliver of hope. He turned his attention back to Roche, whose patience had finally evaporated. "Right, that's it. I'm done talking," Roche declared, his voice loud and final. "We're going through." He looked past Arthur, his jaw set, ready to make his point by marching his entire squad across the hallowed ground. He was a charging bull who saw a red flag, and the old man in front of him was that flag. He braced himself, gathering his muscles to brush the frail-looking groundskeeper aside and put an end to this ridiculous confrontation. The air grew thick and heavy, the scent of roses suddenly cloying, and the stillness of the garden held its breath, waiting for the final act of desecration to begin. Right. Let's crank up the pressure. The confrontation moves from a standoff to a direct, personal assault. Part 3. The escalation. Roche didn't just step forward. He flowed into Arthur's space with the predatory grace of a shark. He didn't shove the old man. That would have been too simple, too quick. This was a performance, and he intended to savor it. He began to circle Arthur slowly, his heavy boots scuffing the edge of the sacred lawn, a deliberate act of contempt. The other candidates watched, a silent, mud-caked chorus. They were caught in the powerful gravity of their leader's cruelty, too intimidated or too exhausted to object. To them, this was just another stress test, another brutal psychological game in a long line of them. Only Trooper Jensen, at the back, looked away, his gaze fixed on the hard gravel at his feet, unable to watch what was unfolding. "You know, your problem is you've been pushing a lawnmower for so long you've forgotten how the real world works," Roche murmured, his voice a low, condescending drawl. He stopped in front of Arthur, so close that the old man would have had to crane his neck to meet his eyes. But Arthur didn't look up. His gaze remained level, fixed on the center of Roche's chest. He just stood there, breathing slowly, a rock in the middle of a foul-mouthed stream. This infuriating calm was what pushed Roche further. He needed a reaction. He needed to see a flicker of fear, of submission. He raised a hand and jabbed a thick, muddy finger into Arthur's thin shoulder. "The world belongs to the strong, old man. To men like me. Not to faded old relics who smell of compost." The finger jabbed again, harder this time. It wasn't enough to hurt, but it was a profound violation, a physical assertion of dominance. "Are you listening to me, or are you as deaf as you are useless?" Arthur remained silent. His stillness was absolute, his self-control a fortress built over decades. He had faced down men with rifles and bayonets. A boy with a bruised ego and an audience was nothing. But then, as Roche drew his hand back, his eye caught a glint of metal against the faded olive of Arthur's jacket. It was the zip pull. Hanging from it was a single, dented piece of brass. A 9mm pistol casing, blackened with age, its base warped where it had clearly struck something with incredible force. To Roche, it was a piece of junk, a strange, worthless trinket, and in his desire to shatter the old man's composure, it presented a perfect new target. He let a cruel, triumphant grin spread across his face. He had found a weak spot, a personal effect, something that might actually matter to this infuriatingly stoic old man. He reached out again, but this time his movements were mockingly delicate. He pinched the grimy casing between his thumb and forefinger, lifting it up for inspection. "Well, well, what have we here?" he said, his voice dripping with theatrical curiosity. Arthur's eyes for the first time dropped to follow the movement. He watched Roche's fingers defiling the small piece of metal, and deep within him, a slumbering dragon stirred. "Don't tell me," Roche continued, holding the casing up to the light. "The key to your garden shed?" He looked back at his audience, playing for laughs. "No, wait, I've got it." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's a medal, isn't it? A special award from the village fete for your perfect petunias." And then he did it. With a final, contemptuous flick of his fingernail, he sent the brass casing tapping against the metal of the zipper. The sound was tiny, an insignificant tink in the vast quiet of the afternoon. But for Arthur, it was as loud as a thunderclap. The world didn't just shift, it fractured. The scent of roses vanished, replaced by the acrid smell of cordite and stale sweat. The gentle warmth of the Herefordshire sun was gone, stolen by the damp, chilling cold of concrete and brick. For a split second, the faces of the smirking candidates blurred, replaced by the wide, terrified eyes of hostages. It was a phantom sensation, an echo of a life he had buried, but the flick of that casing had scraped away decades of soil from the grave. He blinked, and the garden returned, but something had fundamentally changed. The gardener was gone. The man standing in his place was someone else entirely. His pale blue eyes, once calm and observant, now held a chilling, dangerous light, like the reflection of a distant fire. His breathing, though still slow, had a new, profound stillness to it, the absolute economy of a man preparing for violence. From the second-story window of the regimental sergeant major's office, RSM Alastair Finch watched the scene through a pair of binoculars, his knuckles white where he gripped the window frame. He hadn't been watching the candidates. He'd been watching Arthur. Finch was one of the few men on the base who knew exactly who the old groundskeeper was. He had seen Roche's bullying and had let it play out, trusting the old man's famous composure. But when he saw Roche flick that casing, Finch felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't just see a bully pushing his luck. He saw a fool playing with a stick of unstable dynamite, and he saw the look that entered Arthur's eyes in the second that followed. It was a look Finch had only ever seen once before, in the faded photograph of a young SAS trooper standing in the doorway of a captured embassy, a look of profound and terrible focus. Finch lowered the binoculars, his face grim. The boy had finally gone too far. He had crossed a line that he didn't even know existed. The tiny tink of brass on steel does not fade. It echoes, deepens, and transforms into the sharp metallic click of a magazine being seated into the butt of a Browning high-power pistol. The warm Herefordshire sun vanishes, swallowed by a chilling pre-dawn gloom. The scent of roses is scoured away by the smells of oiled steel, stale sweat, and the electric tang of pure, unadulterated fear. It is the 5th of May, 1980, and Arthur Croft is 29 years old again. He's crouched on the narrow stone balcony of the Iranian embassy at Prince's Gate, London. The city is a distant sleeping beast below, its lights blurred into a soft, indifferent glow. But here on this vertical battlefield the world has shrunk to a few square feet of stone, and the dark window that leads into a nest of fanatics. He is clad head to toe in black Nomex overalls, a gas mask hiding his face, its filters making every breath a conscious, rasping effort. In his hands, the cold, familiar weight of his Heckler & Koch MP5 is a comfort, an extension of his own body. He is not a gardener. He is a blade in the nation's hand, held in darkness, waiting to be plunged. A hand clamps down on his shoulder, and Arthur doesn't flinch. He knows the touch. He glances to his side, and through the bug-eyed lenses of their masks he meets the gaze of Sergeant Mac Mackenzie. Mac is a wiry Glaswegian with a sense of humor as dry as sandpaper, and a heart as big as the highlands he came from. Even now, with death a hair's breadth away, Mac finds a moment for connection. He gives Arthur's ammo vest a quick, professional pat-down, checking the magazines are secure. Then he leans in close, his voice a muffled whisper through the respirator. "Don't suppose you brought any biscuits, Art? I'm bloody starving." Arthur just shakes his head, a small smile touching his lips beneath the rubber mask. Mac gives him a thumbs up,
A simple gesture that says everything.
"I'm with you. We'll be all right." It was the last conversation they would ever have. The wait is the worst part. A thick, syrupy silence where every second stretches into a minute, and the only sound is the frantic thumping of your own heart against your ribs. Arthur focuses on his breathing, a slow, steady rhythm, pushing down the adrenaline that threatens to consume him. Down the line he sees a young trooper, barely out of his teens, nervously adjusting the strap on his helmet. The kid's name is Sterling, and he's got good instincts, but his eyes are wide with the terror of the unknown. Arthur makes a mental note to keep an eye on him. Then the crackle in his earpiece, a single clipped voice from their commander on the ground. "All call signs, stand by, stand by." Time seems to stop. Arthur's grip tightens on his weapon. He can feel the collective tension of the men around him, a coiled spring of lethal potential. Go, go, go! The world erupts. A deafening crack shatters the dawn as the frame charge on the window detonates, blasting the entire frame inwards in a shower of glass and splintered wood. Before the sound is even finished echoing, the men are moving. Arthur is second through the gap, right behind Mac. They land on the plush carpet of a dark, opulent room, the air thick with smoke and the screams of the terrified hostages. A stun grenade, a 9-banger, is tossed into the adjoining room and goes off with a blinding flash and a series of thunderous concussions, designed to disorient and incapacitate. This is the storm. Controlled, violent, and utterly overwhelming. Their training takes over. There's no thought, only action. They are a single black-clad organism, flowing through the embassy's corridors, clearing rooms with terrifying efficiency. "Clear," one shouts. "Hostages secure," another calls. It's a symphony of professional violence. They move towards the telex room, where intelligence says the core terrorist group is holed up. Mac is point man, with Arthur and the young trooper Sterling right behind him. As they approach the door, it's kicked open from the inside. A lone gunman, his face a mask of fanatical rage, emerges, his pistol barking. Mac reacts instantly, pushing 2 hostages out of the line of fire as he brings his MP5 up. The terrorist's first shots go wide, but a second lucky round ricochets off the marble archway of the door. Arthur sees it all in horrifying slow motion. The spark of the impact, the small, deadly piece of metal tumbling through the air, heading directly for Sterling's exposed throat. There is no time to think. Arthur shoves the young trooper back with his left hand, while bringing up his own sidearm, his Browning high power, with his right. He fires a double tap, even as the ricochet slams into his pistol with the force of a sledgehammer, the impact numbing his entire arm. The terrorist is thrown backwards, a spray of red against the ornate wallpaper. In that same split second, Mac, who had been focused on the hostages, is hit. A single stray shot from the dying gunman catches him high in the chest, punching through his gear. He stumbles back, a look of profound surprise on his face, before collapsing to the floor. The firefight is over in less than 3 seconds. The silence that follows is deafening, broken only by the whimpering of the rescued hostages and the ringing in Arthur's ears. Sterling is on his feet, pale but alive, staring at Arthur with wide, shocked eyes. But Arthur only has eyes for Mac. He rushes to his friend's side. But he knows it's too late. The light is already fading from Mac's eyes. Amidst the chaos, the smoke, and the grief, something on the floor catches Arthur's eye. Lying on the Persian carpet, next to a spent cartridge from his own weapon, is another casing. It's been violently struck, dented, and warped into a strange, almost floral shape. It's the casing from the round that had been in the magazine of his Browning when the ricochet hit it. A tiny, misshapen piece of brass that had, by a sheer fluke of physics and timing, absorbed the energy of a projectile meant for another man. It was a worthless, ruined thing. And it was the most precious object in the world. It was the last sound of a battle that had saved a life and taken his best friend. Without thinking, he scoops it up, its metal still warm, and closes his fist around it. The smoke of the embassy begins to thin. The dark, ornate room dissolves, its panicked screams fading into the gentle chirp of a sparrow. The harsh smell of cordite gives way to the sweet, earthy scent of roses. The sneering, dead face of the terrorist morphs, sharpens, and becomes the equally sneering, very much alive face of Corporal Declan Roche. Arthur is back in the garden, the sun warm on his face. But he is not alone. The ghost of Prince's Gate is standing with him, and the fire that had been banked for 45 long years is now burning, cold and bright, in the old man's eyes. The journey back from 1980 took less than a heartbeat, but Arthur Croft returned a different man. The gentle, unassuming gardener was a shell. Inside, the soldier stood awake. The cold fire that now burned in his eyes was not the hot, reckless rage of a young man. It was something far older, far more dangerous. It was the icy calm of a man who had walked through the crucible and understood the precise, terrible calculus of violence. He saw Corporal Roche not as a bully, but as a tactical problem, an unstable element that had breached a secure perimeter. His posture, which had been stooped with age, now had a subtle, coiled tension. His weight shifted to the balls of his feet. He was perfectly, terrifyingly still. Corporal Roche, utterly blind to the history replaying behind Arthur's eyes, saw only what he wanted to see: defiance. He saw the old man's sudden stillness not as a warning, but as a final, pathetic act of stubbornness. The flicker of life in the old man's gaze infuriated him. It was as if the gardener was looking straight through him at something far away, dismissing him as an irrelevance. A flush of crimson crept up Roche's thick neck. This simple, ridiculous confrontation was taking too long. It was making him look foolish in front of his men. He had to end it, now. "Right, playtime's over, Grandad," Roche snarled, his voice a low growl of finality. He took a half-step forward, his big frame completely eclipsing the sun. "You've had your little bit of fun. Now get out of my way." His hand came up, not as a fist, but as an open palm. It wasn't a punch, it was an act of pure dismissal. He placed his hand flat on Arthur's shoulder and shoved. It wasn't a violent, aggressive push meant to injure, but a contemptuous, arrogant shove meant to move a piece of furniture, an inanimate object that was in the way. It was the ultimate expression of his belief that Arthur Croft, the man, simply did not matter. Arthur stumbled back a single step, not from the force of the push, which was negligible, but from the sheer, stunning audacity of the act. In over 50 years of service, in training and in combat, he had been battered, shot, and wounded, but he had never, ever been so casually and completely dismissed. The touch was a spark on a short fuse. The fire in his eyes condensed into a single hard point of light. The other candidates, who had been enjoying the spectacle, shifted uneasily. Even their blunted senses could detect that a fundamental line had just been crossed. Trooper Jensen physically flinched, a wave of sickness washing over him. This had gone from a cruel game to something unforgivable. Up in his office, RSM Alastair Finch had seen it all. He had seen the flick of the casing, seen the change in Arthur's eyes, and now he had seen the shove. It was the final straw, an icy, controlled fury, the likes of which he hadn't felt in years, settled over him. This wasn't just a candidate bullying an old man. This was an heir to a legacy, spitting on the crown jewels. Roche, in his arrogance, was not just a bully, he was a cancer, a sickness in the system that Finch had dedicated his life to preserving. If a man like Roche could make it through selection, then the very soul of the regiment was at risk. Finch turned from the window, his face set like granite. His movements were precise, economical, and devoid of any hesitation. He walked to his immaculate mahogany desk. On it sat 3 phones, a standard base line, a secure line for internal command, and a small, unassuming black phone with no dial and a single, direct button. It was a phone he hadn't touched in over 3 years. He picked up the receiver. He pressed the button. On the other end, the line was picked up before the first ring had even finished. There was no greeting, just an expectant silence. Finch's voice was low, urgent, and stripped of all formality. "Sir, Finch," he said, his eyes still on the scene playing out below. "We have a pilgrim in the garden." He let the code word hang in the air for a second. The word was a relic, a term of deepest reverence reserved for the handful of living legends from the regiment's formative years, the men of the Malayan Emergency, of Oman, of Prince's Gate. It was a name that commanded absolute immediate attention. And he's being disrespected by a candidate. Finch's use of the word disrespected was a masterful understatement. It was like calling a Category 5 hurricane a bit of a breeze. He paused, listening to the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "I suggest you come now, sir, to the Memorial Garden. Quietly, if you can." He didn't wait for a lengthy reply. A single, clipped, "On my way," was all he needed. He placed the receiver back in its cradle with a soft, final click. The call had lasted no more than 15 seconds. He walked back to the window and looked down at the drama below. Roche, puffed up with his minor victory, was now gesturing for his men to follow him across the lawn. Arthur stood where he had been shoved, unmoving, watching them with that same terrifyingly calm focus. Finch felt no satisfaction, no glee, only a profound, grim certainty. The wheels of justice, the true justice of the regiment, were now turning. Corporal Roche believed he had just won a small, insignificant battle. He had no idea that he had just lost a war he never even knew he was fighting. Triumph, hot and sweet, flooded Corporal Roche's veins. He had faced down the stubborn old man and won. He had asserted his dominance. With a final, dismissive smirk at Arthur, he turned to his men. "Right, let's move," he commanded, and with a sense of self-satisfaction he took a definitive step, his heavy, mud-caked boot landing squarely on the pristine, emerald-green lawn of the Memorial Garden. The grass, so perfectly manicured, seemed to cry out as it was crushed beneath his weight. He was about to take another step, to lead his squad on their disrespectful shortcut, when the world began to change. It wasn't a sound. It was the sudden absence of it. 100 yards away on the main parade square, a drill sergeant was in the middle of tearing a strip off a new recruit, his voice a roaring torrent of creative insults. Mid-syllable, the roaring simply stopped. The rhythmic, pounding march of a platoon practicing drills faltered, then ceased. Even the distant, rhythmic pop-pop-pop from the firing ranges seemed to fade, as if a giant hand had been placed over the entire base. A deep, unnatural silence began to spread outwards from the main headquarters building, a ripple of pure dread that washed over everything. Roche and his men felt it as a cold prickle on the backs of their necks. They slowed, faltering in confusion, their little bubble of triumphant arrogance instantly punctured by a vague but powerful sense of alarm. Trooper Jensen was the first to see him. His eyes, which had been fixed on the ground in shame, were drawn up by the spreading quiet. He looked towards the sandstone headquarters building, and his heart seemed to stop in his chest. A single figure had emerged from the main entrance. The man was of average height, lean and dressed in an immaculate, unadorned uniform. He wasn't marching. He was walking with a calm, unhurried gait. But there was a quality to his movement, a lethal economy and an absolute, unshakable purpose that made him the instant center of gravity for the entire base. It was Colonel Hamish Sterling, the commanding officer of 22 SAS. The colonel did not look left or right. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, towards the memorial garden. He crossed the vast, empty expanse of the parade ground, and as he moved, the silence deepened around him. Every soldier, every instructor, every candidate within line of sight froze in place. They became statues of men cleaning rifles, statues of men climbing ropes, statues of men shouting orders. It was a phenomenon of pure, instinctual respect and fear. The CO was not a man who left his office for trivialities. His presence on the ground, unannounced, meant that something had gone catastrophically wrong. He was the regiment's final arbiter, and his quiet disappointment was infinitely more terrifying than another man's rage. Roche, still standing with one foot on the sacred lawn, turned his head to see what had spooked his men. When he saw the lone figure striding towards them, the blood drained from his face, leaving a sickly gray pallor beneath his mud-streaked skin. The triumphant smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure, unadulterated terror. The strength seemed to evaporate from his limbs, and for a second he looked like he might collapse. Then, years of brutal training kicked in. With a convulsive, jerky movement, he snapped his body to attention, his back ramrod straight, his eyes locked forward, staring at nothing. His men, seeing his reaction, instantly followed suit. They formed a ragged, muddy, and utterly petrified line of statues, their earlier bravado now a distant, shameful memory. Colonel Sterling did not slow his pace. He stepped from the parade ground onto the gravel path that led to the garden, his polished shoes crunching with a slow, deliberate rhythm that sounded as loud as gunshots in the profound silence. He walked directly towards the line of terrified candidates. Roche's heart hammered against his ribs. He prepared himself for the verbal onslaught, for the career-ending reprimand that was surely coming. But the colonel did not stop. He did not even glance at them. He walked past Corporal Roche as if he were a lamppost, as if he and his men did not exist, their presence so insignificant it wasn't even worthy of a moment's acknowledgement. The sheer, calculated indifference of the act was more humiliating than any shouted insult could ever be. The colonel came to a stop a few feet away, placing himself between the line of petrified candidates and the old man they had been tormenting. He stood on the path, careful not to touch the grass, and for a long moment he simply looked at Arthur Croft. The air crackled with a tension so thick it felt hard to breathe. The entire base was holding its breath, watching. Roche, trembling, dared to flick his eyes to the side. He saw the CO, a man he revered and feared above all others, a living legend of the Special Forces, standing before the old, dirt-stained gardener, and he saw the expression on the colonel's face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It was a look of profound, solemn, and unmistakable respect. In the crushing silence, Colonel Sterling finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a calm, resonant authority that cut through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. He did not address the petrified candidates. He spoke only to the old man. "Arthur," he said, and the name was filled with a warmth and familiarity that made no sense. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It's been too long." Arthur Croft looked at the commander of the most elite fighting force in the world and offered a slow nod in return. "Hamish," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. The sound of the colonel's first name, spoken so casually by a gardener, sent a fresh wave of bewildered terror through the line of candidates. Their universe, with its rigid hierarchies and protocols, was beginning to fracture. Only then did Colonel Sterling turn his attention to the men. His gaze, cold and analytical, swept over them before landing like a physical weight on Corporal Roche. For the first time he acknowledged Roche's existence, and the full, undivided attention of the CO was a terrifying thing to behold. "Corporal Roche," the colonel said, his voice dropping a degree, becoming as sharp and cold as ice. "You are training for the privilege of joining a brotherhood, a history. You are currently standing on its most sacred ground with one of its founding pillars. So I will ask you a simple question. Do you have any idea who this is?" Roche's throat was dry. He tried to swallow but couldn't. His mind was a blank wall of panic. "No, sir," he stammered, the words barely audible. "No, of course you don't," the colonel said, a profound disappointment lacing his tone. "You see a groundskeeper, an old man, an obstacle. You see the uniform he wears today, not the one he earned yesterday." He took a step closer, his gaze sweeping over the other candidates, pinning each of them in turn. "You think you are the tip of the spear. You have no concept of the fire that forged the steel." He gestured towards Arthur, who stood watching, his expression unreadable. "This is Arthur Croft." In 1980, he wasn't a gardener. He was a sergeant in 22 SAS. He was one of the men in black, on the balconies of the Iranian embassy at Prince's Gate. He was part of Operation Nimrod. A collective sharp intake of breath came from the candidates. Operation Nimrod. It was the foundational myth of the modern regiment, a story of breathtaking courage and flawless execution that every single one of them had studied until they knew it by heart. They were legends, ghosts from the history books, and they were being told that one of them was standing right here, smelling of soil and old age. The colonel's eyes locked back onto Roche, and they were merciless. "Men like Sergeant Croft wrote the book that you are barely qualified to read, Corporal. They wrote it in smoke and blood and broken glass, a world away from this green grass you were so eager to defile." He then took another step, his voice becoming quieter, more personal, drawing them all into the memory. "During that siege, I was a young trooper, scared witless, full of more bravado than sense. Not unlike you, Roche. I was behind Sergeant Croft and Sergeant Mackenzie when we breached a room. A terrorist came out firing. Mac was hit. In the same second, a round ricocheted off a wall, a random 1,000,000-to-1 shot, and it came straight for my head." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle in the silent garden. "I never saw it, but Arthur did. He shoved me out of the way, taking the impact himself. He saved my life." The colonel then raised a hand and pointed a single, steady finger at the dented brass casing hanging from the zip of Arthur's jacket. The very same piece of metal that Roche had flicked with such contempt. "You see that piece of junk, Corporal? You asked if it was a medal for his petunias." The shame that washed over Roche was so profound it was a physical force. He visibly sagged, his head sinking towards his chest. "That casing," the colonel continued, his voice ringing with a terrible clarity, "was in the magazine of Arthur's pistol when that ricochet hit it. It absorbed the impact that would have killed me. It is a reminder, not of a battle won, but of a friend lost. And a life saved. My life." The revelation was absolute. The candidate stared at Arthur, no longer seeing an old man, but seeing the ghost of Prince's Gate, a living monument to the very ideals they were striving for. They looked at the small, tarnished piece of brass and saw not a trinket, but a holy relic. Then, the colonel delivered the final, crushing blow, answering the question that hung unspoken in the air. "Arthur Croft is not on the base payroll. He is not a janitor, or a gardener, or a contractor. He is a custodian." When his best friend Mac Mackenzie was killed that day, Arthur made a promise to his family that he would always look after this place, that he would tend the roses planted in Mac's memory. He swept his arm out, indicating the whole garden. "He is here every day, not for money, but for a promise. He is here out of love and out of duty. He is the guardian of our history, of our soul. And you, he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal growl as he turned his full attention back to the utterly broken Roche, spat in his face. Here is the final part of the story, focusing on the consequences, the lesson, and the enduring legacy. Part 8. The lesson and the legacy. The silence that followed the colonel's words was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence thick with shame, awe, and the crushing weight of a truth finally revealed. Corporal Roche stood with his head bowed, the muscles in his powerful frame trembling under a strain no amount of physical training could replicate. He did not look at the colonel. He did not look at his men. He stared at the single crushed patch of grass where his boot had landed, a small, dark monument to his own catastrophic ignorance. The other candidates avoided looking at him, their own shame a palpable force. They looked at Arthur, and for the first time they truly saw him. Colonel Sterling let the lesson sink in, allowing the silence to do its work. When he finally spoke, his voice was devoid of anger, replaced by a clinical, decisive tone. He addressed Roche directly. "Getting you kicked off this course would be the easy option, Corporal. It would allow you to leave with your anger and your pride, blaming anyone but yourself. That is not how we build soldiers here." He paused, his gaze unyielding. "Your new training rotation begins tomorrow morning. 0600 hours, sharp. Your reporting officer," he said, giving a slight nod towards Arthur, "will be Mr. Croft. You will learn how to tend this garden. You will learn the name behind every rose. You will learn to work with your hands, not to destroy, but to cultivate. And you will do it until he tells me you are ready, if that day ever comes." Dismissed. The command was for everyone but Roche. The other candidates, including a visibly shaken trooper Jensen, almost scrambled to get away, their retreat a mess of shame and relief. Roche was left standing alone, a pariah in the quiet garden. Colonel Sterling walked over to Arthur, placing a hand briefly on the old soldier's shoulder. No words were exchanged, but a lifetime of understanding passed between them. Then the colonel turned and walked away, his footsteps receding on the gravel, leaving the old veteran and the disgraced candidate alone in the fading afternoon light. The weeks that followed were a quiet, grueling crucible for Declan Roche. Every morning, as his former squad mates headed for the assault course or the firing ranges, he reported to the memorial garden. The first few days were an agony of silent humiliation. He, the physical powerhouse, was taught how to weed, how to prune, how to mix soil, by a man he had dismissed as a relic. Arthur was not a harsh teacher. He was patient, methodical, and spoke very little. He would demonstrate a task: how to properly deadhead a remembrance rose to encourage new growth, how to clear an invasive weed without disturbing the roots of the plants around it, and simply watch as Roche, with his large, clumsy hands, attempted to replicate the delicate work. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change in Roche. The angry, defensive shell began to crack. He stopped seeing the work as a punishment and began to see the garden for what it was, a living, breathing testament. He learned the quiet rhythm of the place. He felt the satisfaction of seeing a struggling plant revive under his care. He read the names on the black granite wall, every single day, until they were burned into his memory. He saw Arthur not as his jailer, but as a man of profound peace and purpose. He saw the gentle way the old man touched the petals of a specific rosebush, Mackenzie's rosebush, and began to understand that strength was not about shouting and dominating. It was about remembering and honoring, and quietly enduring. One late afternoon, about a month into his new duty, the work was finished. The garden was serene, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Arthur and Roche were cleaning their tools by the small wooden shed. For the first time, the silence between them didn't feel tense or awkward, but comfortable. Arthur sat down on the simple wooden bench that faced the memorial wall. letting out a soft sigh of a man content with his day's labor. After a long moment of hesitation, Roche wiped his earthy hands on his trousers, walked over, and stood before the old man. Arthur looked up, his pale blue eyes questioning. Roche swallowed hard, the last vestiges of his arrogance long since scoured out of him by soil and silence. He looked at the name on the wall, the one he now knew was so central to this entire place. "Arthur," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "Sir, would you tell me about him?" He finally looked at Arthur, his eyes filled not with defiance but with a genuine humble curiosity. "What was he like, Mac?" Arthur looked at the young man for a long time. He saw the shame, yes, but beneath it, he saw a flicker of something new, a desire to understand, a willingness to listen. He saw a soldier who was, perhaps for the first time, ready to learn the most important lesson of all. He gave a slow, thoughtful nod and gestured with a calloused hand to the empty space beside him on the bench. "Sit down, son," Arthur Croft said, his voice soft in the quiet of the evening. "Let me tell you about a real hero.